Intruder, they spat at my grandson by the flagpole. 3 crisp uniforms and a smirk behind perfect teeth, while buses coughed diesel and sun flared off windshields. His hoodie hung heavy with tears, his sneakers scuffed to gray, and I stood there with my blue folder in one hand, watching lanyards and polished shoes circle him like bright knives, the hall monitors clipped voices slicing the air, as if rules were fences built for some and gates for others. I took his shaking hand and walked us through fluorescent corridors that smelled of toner and floor wax, toward the boardroom where the director's pen carved verdicts before questions. She tilted her chin like a small crown, and the counselor stacked papers like bricks, while my boy, all heart and quiet grit, raised his phone to record the truth no memo could hide. The room gleamed cold, chrome, glass, spotless margins, and I felt the old heat in my chest steady into something sharper, because tonight they would learn the weight of their own policy, and the word they use to mark him will meet a section number that does not blink. Before we continue, please subscribe and check in below. Where are you tuning in? If this hits home, share it so fewer elders carry this weight. The word intruder hit me before the bell finished ringing. It came from a knot of students by the flagpole, tossed toward my grandson like a pebble meant to sting rather than bruise. He stopped mid-step, shoulders tucked under his backpack straps, and the sound of cars idling along the curb folded around us like a slow tide. The air smelled of cut grass and hot brake pads. I felt his hand slide into mine the way a person reaches for a railing when a bus lurches. He didn't cry out loud. The tears were already drying into pale tracks on his cheeks, proof that the first wave had washed through him by the time I arrived. I kept my voice steady and kept us moving, past the chatter, past the poster of this month's assemblies, past a trash can with a lid that clanged like a lid on a pot, toward the bench under the sycamore near the lot. He sat and wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. I sat close enough that our elbows almost touched. A gust shook the branches overhead, and dry leaves skittered across concrete. He opened his mouth, closed it, then showed me the class discussion prompt on his phone. Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day. He had spoken up about both, he said, the way the history teacher invited them to do. 2 boys and a girl from the next row had muttered the word intruder when the room got tense. Others stared at him as if the floor only had room for certain feet. He kept his eyes on the phone, like it was a window he could control. I listened and counted my breathing, the way I used to before walking into a night shift that never forgave mistakes. I had come prepared for something, even if I didn't know what form it would take. In my bag was a slim blue folder with an elastic band, the kind you buy from the office supply aisle and end up treating like a safe. Inside lay a simple plan, a paired study unit about both commemorations, a short visit to the city's indigenous monument, a scheduled donation of maritime history books to a local museum, 2 pages of reflection questions designed to shift heat into light. Next to it were letters, one from the history teacher supporting the educational value, one from the school's head administrator acknowledging receipt of my proposal last week, and the stamped notes from a community participation meeting where I'd requested a slot on the council's agenda. The folder felt heavier than paper should.
I told my grandson we wouldn't carry this moment home like a stain. We would carry it to a desk with a pen and a policy attached. He nodded, the way you nod when you want to believe the road in front of you is paved all the way to the end. We stood. The motorcade appearance ebbed. The heat of sun on metal faded into that late afternoon cool a person feels first on the back of the neck. We crossed to the administrative wing. The hallway smelled of floor cleaner and pencil shavings. Fluorescent lights hummed. The receptionist slid a visitor log toward me with soft, practiced efficiency. I signed my name, noted the time, and asked for a form to place an item in the public comment portion of the school board meeting. The form arrived with a paperclip. I slid my folder onto the counter and began stapling. A man in a collared shirt I recognized as the record secretary walked past, glanced at the cover of my folder, and kept walking. A clock ticked with a sharp click, one of those wall clocks that shames you into exactness. I filled the boxes with the care of a person who knows that one unchecked line can become a closed door. I attached the teacher's letter. I attached the administrator's acknowledgement. I attached the sheet from the community meeting with my name circled. I wrote a sentence that belonged to my wife, though she never had the chance to stand at this counter. Ensure equal treatment for educational proposals that promote civic understanding. I could almost see her handwriting over mine, round and firm. My grandson stood slightly behind me, scanning barcodes in the corner of the office where a copy machine blinked. He wasn't hiding, he was helping. He snapped images of each page as I completed them, cropped the edges, saved the files into a folder he named Community Study Unit, then mirrored the folder to cloud storage the way kids do as if they were born holding a backup plan. Every time the camera shutter clicked, it sounded like a small hammer tapping a nail. He looked better with each click. When we were done, the receptionist pressed a stamp onto a corner of the packet. The ink mark came up clean. Date, time, initial. I slid the elastic band over the folder again and thanked her. The secretary returned and asked, without looking at us, if I intended to speak tonight or simply submit. I told him I intended to do both. He pointed with a pen toward a glassed-in board down the hall where the agenda was posted. My grandson and I went to read it. Under Community Proposals, there was a blank line marked as available. I felt a tightness ease in my chest without disappearing. Available meant nothing, not until paper touched microphone. We found the meeting room with enough time to sit and breathe. It had the sterile, careful feel of places where decisions are meant to be public but not intimate. The long table at the front was already aligned with nameplates. Stacks of forms were squared like bricks. On the side wall, a projector threw the agenda onto a screen in a cool blue frame. The chairwoman, people here called her the director, sorted a stack of memos, eyes moving in rapid, efficient slides that told me she had a script for the night and would not gladly entertain ad-libbing. 2 board members murmured over a column named rubrics. I could tell even from the back row who the room belonged to. The air smelled faintly of toner and coffee cooling in a cardboard box. I took the last seat, folded my folder on my lap, and watched as the clock advanced the minute hand in a single, decisive junk. I told myself again why I'd come, not to argue about heroes or villains, not to demand a verdict on a page of history that needed more than one candle to read by. I'd come to ask for process, the same process posted on their own website, equal footing for proposals that met the criteria. In my head, I repeated the section number like a way home, 4.2. My grandson checked the angle of his phone camera and mouthed a question. I nodded. We were not hiding, we were documenting. When the chair opened the floor for public items, my name was called, and the act of standing felt like stepping through a membrane. The chairwoman watched me without curiosity, the way a person watches a train timetable, not waiting for surprise, waiting for sequence. I walked to the podium. My shoes were silent on the carpet. Only the low squeal of a chair in the second row broke the sound. I laid the folder down. I stated my name for the record, my relation to a student, and the purpose of my appearance. I described the unit: paired study, 2 sites in the city, reflection questions meant to refine listening instead of hardening positions. I handed copies of the letters across to the secretary, who clipped them with a small metal click that made the room feel more solid.
I highlighted that the plan fit within the district's own parameters for community-based educational activities. The chairwoman lifted a page and drew a line at the margin with a pen. Her hand moved with a neat, effortless gesture that looked like a reflex. She said the word divisive aloud, not as a slur, not as anger, but as a verdict made of procedure. One of the board members nodded with an expression I knew from job sites, the look of someone who wanted a reason to err on the side of less work. The secretary reached for a new pad of paper and wrote something I could not see. A cold current moved through the room. My grandson's fingers tightened around his phone. I did not raise my voice. I asked for the regulation that guided her classification. I said I would like the relevant text read into the record. I named a section I had memorized and requested equal treatment, not special placement. I placed a folder on edge open to a page where I had highlighted a number. The projector's fan whirred, steady as a ceiling vent. The chairwoman didn't look at the screen. She kept her eyes on the ink stroke she had drawn, as if the ink could hold the evening together. The secretary's chair squeaked again, and someone near the door coughed the dry cough of a room that forgets to drink water. The lights from the projector made a faint halo on the carpet. The shapes on the screen steadied, and then with a soft, hollow pop, the image winked out, and the room dropped into a dim pause that felt like a held breath, and every head turned toward me as if the next page of the night would appear under my hand. The blackout felt like a held breath. Then the screen blinked back to life with the thin blue rectangle, and the agenda reappeared as if nothing had happened. My eyes adjusted slower than the machine. The chairwoman tapped her pen twice, a small percussion that told the room the pause was over and that the evening would keep to its rails. The secretary leaned forward to capture my last sentence, his wrist moving in a tight little arc. I steadied my hands on the edge of the podium. I could smell dust warmed by the projector's lamp and the stale sweetness of coffee that had been poured too early and left to cool. I asked again for the relevant regulation to be read into the record. The chairwoman tilted her chin an inch, a signal that traveled down the table to the secretary without touching me. He reached for a binder, the kind of thick, institutional book that means business and delay at the same time, and started flipping. The pages whispered. Behind me, a chair leg scraped. My grandson shifted his weight and lifted his phone slightly, framing the front table in a quiet, steady shot. The steadiness of it was a rope to hold. I repeated the section number, an address we both knew by heart now. The secretary found the tab, but instead of reading, he slid a form in my direction and said the submission appeared incomplete. No rubric for cross-curricular integration, no second signature from a co-sponsoring department, and an outdated version number on the community meeting sheet. His voice was flat, the tone of a man who breathes papers, who believes firmly in the gravity of absent boxes. I felt the room lean with him. The chairwoman's pen stayed poised over the margin, as if she were waiting for the ink to dry on a thought already decided. The word divisive sat somewhere above us, heavy as an unclaimed coat.
I asked to see the form he was referencing. The paper slid across the polished wood with a controlled hiss. The letters were small, the checkboxes smaller. The smell of toner rose up again. I read the lines as if they were rungs of a ladder I could not afford to miss. Cross-curricular integration, it said, required a brief description if the activity involved more than one subject area. I pointed to the reflection questions about civic action and historical interpretation and said they were designed for history and English. The secretary nodded once, as if to grant that words could be facts, but forms were destiny. He placed a finger on the second signature line and said co-sponsorship would remove questions about scope. He placed a second finger on the date of the community sheet and said a fresh copy would show that participation had been ongoing, not a single isolated note. The accumulation felt familiar. Not one roadblock, not one brick wall, but a series of polite hedges that force a person into circles until the light changes and the building closes. I kept my voice level and asked that the Section 4.2, my mind set it the way it was printed, Section 4.2 be consulted for guidance on equal treatment when criteria are substantially met. I said the unit met the district's own measures for educational value and community benefit, with documentation to prove it. I asked that the text be read aloud and entered in the minutes. The chairwoman made no move to read. The secretary bent to his notes again, the pen working as if it could tunnel through the evening and leave me behind. I opened the blue folder on the podium and spread my papers the way a field medic lays out tools, each within reach, each with a purpose. The letter from the history teacher, the acknowledgement from the administrator, the list of books already boxed for the museum, the email from the cultural center confirming a welcome at the monument. I set a clear plastic sleeve on top with the regulation photocopied earlier that day, the number marked in yellow. The slick of the plastic caught the overhead light. In the front row, someone shifted a stack of agendas and the paper edges aligned with a neat clap, like a quiet verdict. Behind me, my grandson moved. He stepped into the aisle just enough to steady his frame, careful not to block anyone. He tapped his phone screen to lock focus, then opened the document folder and held up the timeline we had built together in the kitchen, each step dated, each confirmation attached. He did not speak. He made a small motion with his wrist, a suggestion more than a request, as if to say that this story had receipts. The motion cut through the fog in my chest. The boy still had salt on his face from earlier, but his posture said we were not simply at the mercy of the room. The chairwoman finally nodded toward the secretary. He read the title of the policy, the preamble about community involvement, the dry promise of impartiality. He hesitated at the body of the text, then summarized rather than quoting the lines where the language mattered. I asked that he read the section verbatim, line by line, and the room exhaled, a long, low, collective sigh that something was taking longer than it should. He obeyed then, his voice flattening any nuance the text might have had, but the words still did their work. Equal treatment, substantially similar proposals, timely review, measurable benefit, non-discriminatory enforcement. The phrases landed like stones across a water that looked, moments before, too wide to cross. The chairwoman rotated her pen so the clip faced her. She said in the same clear, procedural tone that the proposal remained divisive and could be deferred pending completion of the missing items. The secretary lifted the form again as if to show the crowd what fairness looked like. In the third row, a board member in a neat blazer leaned toward his colleague and whispered, not unkindly, the way a nurse might whisper about a patient in the hallway, "Better to push this a month." The words were not meant for me, but the hallway feeling was. I thought of the boys at the flagpole, how their word was a pebble. This now was a river course changed one sandbag at a time.
I asked that my request be entered in the minutes, to have a district-level supervisor present to clarify the application of Section 4.2 to this proposal, and to confirm whether deferment for paperwork that could be supplied within 48 hours was consistent with past practice. My mouth was dry. I could feel the coolness of the air vent on my scalp. The pen in my hand knocked once against the plastic sleeve and left a faint dot on the copy. I said the words firmly, not as a threat, not as theatrics, but as the next rung in the ladder we had agreed to climb. The chairwoman exchanged a look with the secretary that I knew from job sites and front desks and waiting rooms, a stress test of patience and policy. The secretary picked up the desk phone, dialed, listened. His face didn't move.
He asked for a moment to place an institutional call and suggested a brief recess. The gavel, or the wooden block that served as one, tapped down gently. Chairs rustled, the projector hummed on, casting the agenda into a room that suddenly acted as if it had no audience. During the recess, I gathered the scattered copies into a new order. The blue folder clicked when the elastic slid home, an ordinary sound that reminded me I owned this small piece of the evening. My grandson stood by my side now, not filming, but sorting thumbnails on his screen. He tagged each document with simple names: teacher letter, admin receipt, monument confirmation, museum donation. Then opened a new note and typed out the regulations' key phrases word for word. The keys clicked like rain beginning. He glanced up at me and then down again, absorbed, and every so often he breathed out in a way that let the tension escape without abandoning the posture of attention. He was my counterweight. The room could tilt, but he would hold my line. The break was short. People returned with paper cups of water that tasted like pipes. A board member dabbed a coffee ring into the sleeve of his blazer and frowned. The chairwoman recalibrated the angle of her nameplate. The secretary reset his pad, then disappeared down the side hallway with the phone receiver in one hand and the binder in the other. I stayed at the podium, upright, because sitting felt too much like giving half of the ground back. My eyes fell on the detail of the carpet pattern, a repeating grid that pretended to be endless. I told myself to stay inside the rectangle of this moment, nothing behind, nothing ahead, just the page we were on. When the secretary returned, his shoes made hardly any sound. The hallway smell, cool, institutional air with a trace of something floral from a vending machine, came with him. He spoke to the chairwoman first, low and quick, then lifted his eyes to the room. My grandson's phone camera climbed half an inch as if it too leaned in to hear. The chairwoman gave a single nod, and the secretary stepped to the microphone, cleared his throat once, and delivered the line that tightened every spine by a notch. The secretary said the supervisor was en route, and the room shifted on its hinges. Air moved across faces as if someone had opened an invisible door. The chairwoman straightened her stack of memos until the corners made a single, perfect square. A printer in the side hall began to spit paper, a faint flutter like sparrows behind a wall. I felt my pulse in my fingers where they pressed the edge of the podium. The projector's fan kept its low, patient spin, washing the carpet in a pale hum of light. Behind me, my grandson steadied the frame again. I could hear the soft squeak of his shoe as he corrected his footing, and the tiny mechanical click as his camera locked focus. It sounded like a promise kept small so it wouldn't scare anyone.
The supervisor arrived without a flourish, carrying a gray folder and a legal pad, the uniform of someone who has learned to transmit authority in quiet tones. He did not shake hands. He asked for the item by number, the way a mechanic asks for a part when the hood is already up. The secretary slid our packet to him with a careful thumb on the corner to keep the paper square. The supervisor asked for precedent files, recent ones, comparable ones. The request hit the room like a change in barometric pressure. The chairwoman nodded, because not nodding would be a breach of ritual. In the second row, a board member capped his pen and waited, suddenly very still. While folders were gathered, I stayed upright, feet under me, palms open on the acrylic lip that kept the papers from sliding. The podium smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I was aware of every small texture, the grain of the wood, the press of the elastic on the blue folder, the dry place on my lip where I'd been biting without noticing. I told myself silently to keep the ladder step by step. No speeches, no grand arc, just the rung in front of me. The supervisor laid out the precedent files in a simple line and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. He did not look at me. He looked at the dates, the signatures, the rubric check marks, the stamps that mean the difference between a door and a mirror. He asked the secretary to identify which proposals included sensitive subject matter and how those were handled. A list formed in graphite and paper. A pilot approved last spring with safeguards. A museum partnership greenlit with a letter on the day of the meeting, and the rest to follow. An oral history project advanced on the strength of a single email. He circled each example as if he were drawing small constellations. My throat tightened, not with relief, not with anger, but with the loneliness of recognizing a pattern you have been trying to describe for years. The room had a smell now of warm plastic from the projector and the faint sweetness of a breath mint unwrapped somewhere in the back row. My grandson moved to catch the table of precedence in his shot. His breathing rose and fell like a metronome, steady enough to lean on without leaning all the way. I slid my copy of Section 4.2 forward so the supervisor could see the yellow band of highlight. He lifted the page and read in silence, lips barely moving. He asked the secretary to read it into the record. The secretary obliged, but the words fell like nails dropped on the no-limb, hard, exact, easy to lose if you didn't follow the pattern. Equal treatment for substantially similar proposals. Timely review within posted time frames. Measurable public benefit. Non-discriminatory enforcement. Each phrase struck the table and sat there, small and metallic, daring anyone to kick it under the furniture. The chairwoman did not shift. Her pen hovered over the margin again, a bird waiting for a safe place to land. Then the secretary turned to our packet and located the missing item, the second signature on a co-sponsorship line from a different department. The kind of thing that can be secured with 2 emails and a walkthrough, not the kind that should erase months of careful preparation. He noted it aloud with the placid precision of a lab report. The room accepted the note the way a field accepts a stake, unhurried, inevitable. The supervisor did not look up. He marked the line with a dot and asked the question that hung in the air between us as cool as the conditioned air itself, whether the absence of a single readily supplied line had justified deferment under the very policy that pledged equal footing. The chairwoman faced him fully for the first time, the expression of someone adjusting to a light she did not control.
I felt the invisible weight of every time I'd been told to come back later, to find a different door, to accept that order was a kind of courtesy I was free to admire but not entitled to use. It accumulated in my shoulders the way dust accumulates on a windowsill, a haze you don't notice until the sun hits it just so. My grandson pressed the edge of the phone to his cheek for a second, maybe to cool the heat there, maybe to steady his hands. He shifted the display to a document view that placed our timeline next to the policy excerpt, boxed and labeled. He had done it at our kitchen table with a pencil behind his ear like his grandmother used to do, not because he needed the pencil, but because the posture made the work feel possible. The supervisor spoke softly to the secretary, asked for the last 5 votes on comparable items and whether additional documents had been permitted post-vote. He traced his finger over dates. He paused at a case from the last quarter where a proposal with a similar gap had proceeded to pilot with a 48-hour window for the supplemental file. He drew a small arrow, a gesture so modest a person could miss it. He took up his pen again and wrote a sentence on his pad. The graphite sounded like a distant zipper being pulled.
He turned to the chairwoman and asked that the minutes reflect the policy language exactly, that the reading be verbatim, that the precedents be attached, that the justification for any divergence from past practice be explicit. The ask was not accusatory. It was a request for the room to share the weight of its own rules. I watched the chairwoman swallow, a movement so slight it could have been a trick of light. Somewhere near the door a shoe squeaked. The sound ran across the carpet like a line on a map. My chest loosened at the edges, not because anything had been solved, but because someone else was lifting the stone with me. Oppression is not always a shout. Sometimes it is a pleasant tone backed by a calendar. I felt the calendar in the way the clock's second hand clicked, a mechanical tongue licking time off the face of the night. I reached down and touched the elastic band on the blue folder, proof that I had not shown up empty-handed, proof that I knew what it meant to be asked to come correct and had come correct. The supervisor, still in that even voice, asked the secretary to prepare 2 options for the chair: to maintain deferment with detailed rationale under Section 4.2, or to move forward with a pilot conditioned on submission of the missing co-sponsorship within 48 hours and the safeguards the board routinely applied. This did not feel like a favor. It felt like a mirror held up at the right angle. The secretary nodded and began to draft the language, letters forming with the careful bluntness of block print. The sound of pen on paper had the dry thunder of a distant train. My grandson eased closer to the aisle. From the corner of my eye, I saw him tilt the screen to catch the supervisor's notes, then the 2 neat columns the secretary formed. He had learned when to be still and when to move forward half a step. His stillness poured ballast into the space beneath my ribs. I exhaled through my nose and counted 4, the way I had taught him to do when nerves tried to show off.
The chairwoman asked for the options to be read aloud for clarity. The secretary complied. Words entered the air and hung there, not yet attached to action. A few people shifted in their seats as if the upholstery had cooled. The projector's light flooded once, not an outage this time, more like a blink. The room smelled more strongly of paper now, as if the building itself had leaned in to listen. I waited. My voice stayed quiet inside me, but alert, a dog at a door. The secretary finished reading. The supervisor added a note that the policy called for non-discriminatory enforcement, not just in theory, but in sequence and timing. The chairwoman stared at her memo stack and made one final small adjustment, the kind of adjustment a person makes when there is nothing left to adjust but their posture. Then she asked for a motion to proceed to a vote. The words were clean and dry. The motion moved. A second followed. The secretary reached for the microphone control, hand poised like a man about to touch a switch on a live panel. My grandson held his breath so long, I felt it in my own lungs. A hand rose from the second row, and a voice requested a quorum check just as the microphone light turned red. If you're still with me, tap like, drop your opinion in the comments, and share. Your voice pulls more chairs to this table. The request for a quorum check cut the air like a thin wire, and then the room did what rooms do when rules step forward. It adjusted. The chairwoman straightened. The secretary paused with his finger on the microphone switch, and heads turned toward the attendance list pinned to the binder's first tab. The board member who had raised the concern kept his hand aloft until the acknowledgement landed. The projector hummed through it all, steady, a machine that only understands one job at a time. The secretary called names in a calm procession, the way a person would count out pills before closing a pharmacy drawer. Each yes
added a small weight back onto the table. Present, present, present. I watched the columns align on his page, black marks marching into the shape of authority. My grandson lowered his phone a fraction, capturing the roll call as if it were a weather reading. Readings rise, readings fall. You keep the record so no one can say the sky was clear when it wasn't. The chairwoman nodded when the last name answered. There was enough of us to work. The room relaxed by one notch, not to comfort, just to function. The secretary lifted the options again, and at the chair's instructions, read them in full. The words did not change, but their edges softened now that they were spoken cleanly and in order. Proceed with deferment and attach a written rationale under Section 4.2, or proceed with a limited pilot with defined safeguards and a 48-hour window for the co-sponsorship line. He placed both on the table for the board to consider. The supervisor added a practical note, almost gentle, that whichever path was chosen, the minutes should hold the language as is, so future rooms would inherit clarity instead of fog. I felt the desk under my fingertips as something like level ground. We closed small loops while they conferred. The history teacher, seated near the aisle, lifted 2 fingers politely and offered through the secretary a short memo confirming cross-curricular integration with English, signed and dated that afternoon. The paper smelled faintly of the classroom where it had been printed. Dry paper, old tape, the ghost of a whiteboard marker. The secretary took it, clipped it to our packet, and made a note. My grandson added the photo to his timeline and tagged it with the teacher's initials. The act felt ceremonial in the most useful way, not pomp, but care.
The administrator's acknowledgement that I had filed a request last week made its way back into the conversation, too. It had never left the folder, but now it was invited to the table. The secretary underlined its date with the tip of his pen. A board member glanced at the stamp and then at the clock, a visible calculation of sequence. I could see how the pieces began to assemble into a shape that resembled fairness, not because anyone had a revelation, but because everyone could point to the same set of lines and agree they existed. The supervisor asked that the policy excerpt be read again, and this time the secretary did not summarize. He read in a slow cadence that matched the print. Equal treatment for substantially similar proposals, timely review, measurable benefit, non-discriminatory enforcement, transparency of criteria, allowance for minor supplementation when plans are otherwise complete. The phrases did not glow, they did not shine, they sat flat and useful, like tools laid out on a cloth. The chairwoman kept her eyes on the text until the last period. Then she asked the secretary to prepare suggested safeguards in case the board wished to move forward with a pilot. Safeguards took shape as if they had been waiting behind a door. The secretary wrote in square hands, "Teacher oversight during all activities. Clear scope written and shared with families. A short balanced pre-brief provided by the history department. A reflective writing component collected for accountability. A brief training for front office staff on neutrality in receiving community proposals. Confirmation that all sites were nonpartisan and educational in nature. A report back to the board with outcomes and recommendations." He read each line aloud. The room did not cheer or grumble. It breathed in the idea of boundary and structure. I felt a thread loosen inside my chest. Not victory, not yet, not even close, but the sensation of being seen within the grammar of the place. My grandson glanced at me and then back to his screen, adding a note under the training line. Front desk neutrality, 30 minutes. He liked numbers you could put on a calendar.
I thought of his grandmother's notebooks, where she stored small methods for making large feelings manageable. Name the rule, write the step, lay out the tools, breathe. Her voice was as present as the lemon cleaner laced into the podium's wood grain. The precedent files the supervisor had requested returned from the copier with the dull warmth of fresh pages. He placed them on the table in order of decision date and slid the top one toward the chairwoman. The board members leaned in, shoulders making a small inward circle around the paper. I could hear the faint scratch of a sleeve against the laminate. The supervisor summarized each case in one sentence, not his opinion, but the recorded fact. Pilot approved with conditions. Documentation to follow within 2 days. Museum partnership scheduled with letter on file day of. Oral history project cleared, contingent on a parent communication template. He capped his pen and rested it along the spine of his pad. It felt like the room had been reminded of its own handwriting. The chairwoman asked the secretary to attach copies of those precedents to the minutes for context. The secretary nodded, wrote the instruction, and dated it. He turned to me and requested the digital versions of our confirmations from the museum and the cultural center, if available, for completeness. My grandson stepped forward one more pace and offered the scannable codes from his phone. The secretary scanned them with a handheld device I hadn't noticed before. A small green light flashed with each successful capture. I felt the fabric of my jacket shift as I breathed deeper. The small green light was not an answer to anything, but it was the opposite of erasure.
We attended to other small matters that threatened to snag the hems of the evening. The outdated community sheet was addressed with a fresh copy the secretary printed on the spot after verifying with the clerk that the meeting had indeed included my request to be on the agenda. He stapled the new sheet over the old, leaving both visible. The cross-curricular box on the form gained a neat note, "See attached memo." The co-sponsorship line remained blank on paper, but in the quiet between voices, the history teacher leaned toward the aisle and raised a pen, and the secretary, without breaking order, noted for the record that the co-sponsorship would be routed internally within the posted 48-hour window should the board choose the pilot path. That sentence sat in the minutes like a bridge drawn in pencil before the boats go in. My grandson returned to his seat and aligned his phone on the edge of the chair in front of him. His face looked older than it had at the flagpole, not in years but in steadiness. He scrolled to the top of the timeline and swiped down slowly, checking that there were no gaps big enough for a person to slip through later and claim not to have seen what was there. He pressed his lips together once and released them, a habit he has when he is about to finish a task and put his hands in his pockets. The supervisor spoke toward the record one more time, recommending that whichever option the board selected, a plain language note be added to the website under the policy section, so that parents and community members could see the process without guessing at it, what to submit, how it is reviewed, when they can expect to hear back. It was a small thing, the kind that prevents 1,000 frictions. The chairwoman agreed to include that suggestion in the follow-up list for the policy subcommittee. A board member wrote the words "website note" in a margin and drew a square around them. The square looked tidy and promising. I kept my eyes on the page in front of me. The policy excerpt I had carried in the plastic sleeve now smudged at the corner where my thumb had rested. The smudge did not make the print less legible. I thought of how many times I had stood in rooms like this, feeling like my presence was an extra step to be managed rather than a part of the process. Tonight, the process had a shape I could trace with my finger. The shape was not finished, but it existed. When the secretary looked up again, he had a small stack of papers aligned and ready.
The options and final wording, the safeguards typed and numbered, the precedents clipped, the policy excerpt appended, the attendance roll complete. He slid a copy toward each board member. The rustle of paper moved down the line like wind through a narrow stand of trees. The chairwoman placed her palm flat on the table for a moment, grounding herself or the room or both. Then she lifted the hand away and folded it with the other, the way people do when they are almost ready to act and want their fingers out of the way. I closed my folder and kept it under my palm, not to hide it, but to feel its weight. The blue had dulled under fluorescent light to the color of calm weather. My grandson's shoe touched my heel lightly, not a nudge, just presence. The projector's glow softened at the edges where it met the wall. The clock rolled its second hand forward without pride. The air was cool enough to keep breath thoughts steady. For the first time all evening, the room felt level, and I stood inside that levelness, prepared for whatever the rules required next. The secretary distributed the final pages down the line, and the room settled into the shape of decision. Paper touched wood, chairs edged closer. The projector washed the wall in pale blue. I stood with my palm on the blue folder, feeling the smooth ridge of the elastic under my thumb. My grandson stood 2 steps behind me, quiet as a lighthouse, his phone steady, the lens a small circle of witness. The chairwoman folded her hands, then unfolded them, then placed one flat on the table. She asked for the motion to be read once more. The secretary read it cleanly, without embroidery. 2 paths, both grounded in the same policy language, now fastened to the minutes like a hinge.
The air was cool enough to keep breath from fogging the moment. I could smell paper warmed by the projector lamp and the faint citrus from the podium's wood. The supervisor rested his pen against his pad and looked toward the chairwoman, not as a dare, not as pressure, but as a reminder that the room had taught itself its own rules tonight. The chairwoman lifted her eyes to the board members and called for the vote. Names moved across the table with the tempo of rain on a roof. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each yes landed with a dry click from the secretary's pen. One abstention rose and fell like a harmless wave. No voices argued the text now. The text had taken the seat where opinion had been. The motion carried. A limited pilot approved with safeguards, a 48-hour window for the co-sponsorship, the policy excerpt attached to the record, precedents appended for transparency, and a brief staff training on neutrality at the front desk. The chairwoman directed the secretary to draft a notice clarifying the process on the district's website. The gavel touched wood, not as a threat, but as punctuation. I did not cheer. I breathed. My shoulders dropped a fraction. My grandson's phone lowered just enough that I could see his face. Not smiling, not crying, just settled like a small boat finding the center of a cove after riding the chop. He looked older by a day that would not show up on any calendar. The chairwoman asked if I had anything to add for the record. I said only that the plan's purpose was learning and service in equal measure, and that I appreciated the board's adherence to the posted rule. My voice sounded like it belonged to the room. Consequences took their places without ceremony. The chairwoman instructed the secretary to schedule the staff training for the following week, 30 minutes at the start of the day, front office and aides included. The history department would draft a balanced pre-brief to accompany the field components, the wording to be reviewed for clarity and neutrality. The policy subcommittee received the task of uploading the plain language note. The form with the outdated community sheet gained its new stapled top copy and a handwritten notation for cross-curricular integration referencing the teacher's memo. The missing co-sponsorship moved into a short corridor of action.
The teacher's department head would route it internally within the allowed window. None of it felt like a parade. It sounded like careful drawers sliding shut in a tidy room. The chairwoman turned toward me once more, her eyes level. She said the board expected the report back promised in the safeguards, with outcomes and recommendations, and that the minutes would reflect that the initial classification had been reconsidered in light of the policy language and recent precedents. It was not an apology, but it was a record of change written in the right ledger. For the first time that evening, her pen, which had lived so long over the margins, lay flat on the paper, as if it had spent the last of its posture. The supervisor thanked the board for the clarity and suggested a brief debrief with the secretary before the room emptied. He looked my way, not through me, not past me. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He set the policy page beside our packet as if he were returning a tool to its shelf. I nodded. The lemon cleaner in the podium's grain seemed sharper now, as if the wood had warmed a degree. My grandson slid his phone back into his pocket and stepped up beside me. His shoulder brushed my arm, a small touch I would have noticed in a crowd of 1,000. The history teacher stood and with the quiet confidence of a person who knows his work will carry tomorrow, promised to email the pre-brief draft within the hour. The secretary collected the scattered copies, squared them into a single stack that did not wobble, and clipped them with a snap that sounded like the lid of a tin closing on something useful. The projector winked to the resting screen, where the district logo floated in a slow drift. The room smelled faintly of cool air and paper, normal things put back in order.
When the chairwoman adjourned, people rose without scraping chairs. Voices returned to human volume. I signed the receipt acknowledging the 48-hour window and the pilot conditions. The ink flowed evenly. The dates' numbers lined up like fence posts. No one blocked our path to the door. No one called us divisive. My grandson held the door open for me, and then for a board member with an armful of binders. Outside, evening had gathered itself into a blue that felt like water. The first street light hummed with a moth circling it. Car doors whispered shut. The night held room for a quiet pride that did not need to perform for anyone. In the parking lot's soft dark, my grandson let the phone glow between us and scrolled through the timeline we had made. Photos, scans, notes. The regulation, highlighted. The precedents, captured. The safeguards, typed. The vote, recorded. He stopped at the first image, the one beneath the sycamore by the flagpole, and then back to the last, the one where the policy language sat bold on the screen. He exhaled, a sound like a small wave finding sand. I put a hand on his shoulder. It fit as if made to do so. The consequences would travel beyond this night, but the first shape of them was clear enough to touch. The training would happen. The website would gain a window instead of a wall. The form that had felt like a maze now had arrows painted on the floor. The words equal treatment had been spoken into a microphone with the power to carry them. The chairwoman would sign minutes that admitted the path had bent and then straightened. The front desk would learn to say, "Here is the box you need," and mean it. Nothing erased the word that had started our afternoon, but something larger folded over it. An act recorded that refuted the quiet habit of delay masquerading as fairness. We stood for another breath, then walked. The night air tasted clean, like after a brief, welcome rain. My shoes clicked softly on the concrete. The blue folder rested against my ribs, no heavier, no lighter, exactly the weight of the work we had done. My grandson slipped his hand into mine the way people do when they have made it across a long plank and want to feel wood become ground.
In the reflection of the school's glass doors, we looked like a shadow and its source standing side by side. At the car, I paused and lifted my face to the sky that did not know our names and did not need to. Peace is not the same as victory, I thought, but it is the place where a person can loosen their jaw and plan the next right step without a tremor. The door handle was cool in my hand. The engine would turn over. The road home would still be there. Inside my chest, something unclenched that had been holding for years. I closed my eyes once and opened them again. No one has to dim another's memory to light a better morning. We honor each other when we keep the rules that protect us all. Did this move you? Like, subscribe, and say in the comments how you'd handle it with your family. See you in the next chapter.